Boardroom Bound, episode 175, exploring diversity of thought with an international corporate governance expert, with Tracy Gopal.
They're just focused on how do I keep my business going as I've done for the past 40 years. So with that, the way to get the new class, you can't completely replace it, but moving slowly is the idea. And so what I promote is well-trained, skills-based, diversely comprised directors who are focused on value creation.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Tracy Gopal, and she is a corporate governance expert, and you will hear she has incredible deep subject matter expertise into corporate governance in Japan. And you're going to hear how that has changed dramatically over the last decade, and so many lessons that apply to what we're doing here, let's say in American corporate governance, other parts of the world, improving diversity of thought, and what that can mean for all of us as we go about searching for the next board seat that we're looking for. Before we jump into today's show, I'd like to share a message from our sponsor about board director education and certification. Want to join your first board or looking for additional board seat opportunities? In either scenario, be sure to be disciplined in your approach through the Becoming an Exceptional Board Director Candidate Education and Certification course. Get both the modern board director candidate packaging and modern board operations knowledge integrated with one program. Remember, the key to landing additional or your first board seat is in your packaging. Make the effort to do it right. Program graduates also receive their globally recognized International Board Director Competency designation upon course completion, available in one-on-one, group, or on-demand registration options. You can learn more at bit.ly, that's bit.ly/IBDC-D. So bit.ly/IBDC-D. And now, let's jump into the show. Tracy Gopal, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm excited to have you on this show today because as you and I were talking about beforehand, we've done a little bit of sort of Asian governance, if I call it that, in the past. Usually it's been centered around Australia because they have such great corporate governance. And we, in addition to having great higher level advice and guidance today, we're also going to hear a lot about what corporate governance is like in Japan because you're an expert on the topic. You spent a lot of time focusing in that space in addition to your just sort of general corporate governance expertise. But we probably need to back up the story a little bit and come to a bit of the beginning of your career arc in order to understand how you got to this position today.
So I can start with my career. I had a traditional career out of college, did the MBA, joined Ernst & Young, learned finance and financial transactions, restructuring. But there was a thread in all of my work. Even my first day at Arthur Andersen, back in 1993, I raised my hand and introduced myself and said, if there's anything related to Japan, call on me. And even before that, I left out that after college, I spent 1 year teaching English in Japan. So as I go through my career, the main thread is basically a strong business focus, but always everything to me was so much more interesting when looking at it through the lens of Japan. So just very briefly, after MBA, I worked with Ernst & Young for several years and was exposed to corporate governance. And then I made a mindful shift about a decade ago. I wanted to learn corporate governance. And so I was able to join ISS, which was an amazing training ground for learning the mindset for how to improve corporate governance to both generate value and mitigate risk for shareholders.
Now, Tracy, some people may not know ISS, even though if you're in the finance space, you definitely get it. But, sort of corporate governance proxy advisor is probably the shorthand most people would think. Help us understand what that actually looks and feels like to work there and what you're doing on a regular basis.
Oh, absolutely. So ISS is one of the two largest proxy advisors in the world. And they basically right. I mean, I know their business has expanded much beyond since I left the company, and now they're in many areas. But the main idea is that ISS will advise institutional investors who have to, exercise their fiduciary duties and vote at all the annual meetings and special meetings for their companies around the world. And ISS, I always call it kind of a Cliff Notes, where I grew up with the Cliff Notes, where you have the short answers to the key issues for each proxy statement for each company around the world. And so ISS writes research on every company, on every meeting, on every ballot item around the world. Even if there's a client that has one share of one company, ISS will write the research on that. And investors then take that research, and all investors are different, and they can either vote with ISS, they can have their own custom policy, they can choose which ISS research they agree with the conclusion on and which they don't agree. But it's basically a reference point to help investors vote on which ballot items put forth by the company will best promote corporate governance and be in the best interest of shareholders.
And I think this is really a topically discussion today. It's so relevant at the moment. Everyone thinks about, say, the ESG, and we're paying so much more attention to what organizations are doing, how they're going about it. ISS has been doing this for a long time, even when sort of the mainstream public wasn't reading about it on the top fold of the newspaper. It just seems so much more natural today. And in some ways, that's a great thing. Clearly, a great corporate governance training ground. And it sounds like it really brought your passions to the front even more than before. And so from there, you've gone and launched into this wonderful venture you're doing, sort of, I would say, being a pathfinder over in Japan, really helping change corporate governance there. So tell us about this. Give us about a bit of a history. When most of us think about investing in Japan, we think, well, this is one of the 5 biggest markets in the world. It must be robust. It must be very clear. And it's sort of grown and changed a lot over the last decade or so. Tell us about some of that so we can understand where it is today.
Sure. So Japan is an amazing place, and I know so many people who love Japan. And Japan gets so much right. I mean, we can admire so many things about Japan. However, one area that Japan has lagged globally, which has been quite detrimental to its economy, is the lack of corporate governance. And I will explain. I mean, not long ago, when I say not long ago, I really mean not long ago, like a decade ago, Japanese boards were mostly insiders. And by mostly insiders, that's no outside directors, no board independents, and there was zero diversity. And again, even just a decade ago, maybe the numbers were 1% female. It was trivial. And the reason for that, right, is that the Japanese mindset for corporate governance was very different. There wasn't a very strong investor focus. There was little focus on ROE, return on equity. There was no need to even consider, or there was a feeling that there was no need to even consider the interests of shareholders. And with that, there was little accountability in the management, right? They had these relationships with other companies, their main bank, and so all of the main banks and their shareholders were mostly cross-shareholdings, which means they held stock in company X held shares in company Y held shares in company X, and they would just vote for each other. So if you would look at the ballot items from a decade ago, it was always like 99.9%, no matter like what you were doing. So with no accountability, no focus on shareholders, no expert opinions, and no diversity on the boards, investors actually started withdrawing from Japan. They weren't seeing the returns. They didn't believe in Japan. And that was quite detrimental. And if you ever go back and look at just a stock market chart of what happened in Japan, they have yet to recover after over 30 years from where they were in their peak in the 80s. And right. The idea to revitalize Japan was through corporate governance. And so my company that I originally named Third Arrow Strategies was based on former Prime Minister Abe's third arrow for economic revitalization for Japan, which included many items, but the core of which was corporate governance, investor stewardship, along with womenomics topics. And so the idea there was to revitalize through Japan through proving to investors that Japan is now serious about corporate governance. Japan is going to change. They're going to take outside views and consider shareholder needs. And that has been what has been helping Japan improve over, say the past 7-8 years.
Now, this is fascinating. In some ways, it's almost like the Wild West. If it's really beginning to professionalize and change and diversify, wonderful opportunities for new ideas, new insights, innovation to come into the boardroom, and probably part and parcel with diversity in the boardroom space. But you almost need a new emerging class of board directors to grow up and be ready to take on those opportunities. And that's a cultural change in a culture that doesn't change very often. So tell us a bit about how that's going and how you're helping change it, because I'm sure that to some extent it needs to be pushed and pulled, right?
No, that's actually true. And people have always said that, Japan can change quickly when they want to. But right now it has taken Japan a long time to change. And investors are now getting frustrated with the slow pace of change. And so even first they have the requirement of one independent director. Then the corporate governance code has 2 independent directors. Now the Tokyo Stock Market Exchange is restructuring, and companies which will now be in what they call the prime market will have higher requirements for director independence. And globally, investors, the leading ones, UBS, CalSTRS are saying, no, we want you to have 30% diversity and we want you to have majority independence. So they are really raising the bar and not trying to say, okay, we understand change is hard, we'll give you time. But you were exactly right that we do need a new class of directors. And what I always say is that, societal change is hard. I do not in any way fault Japan for going slowly, because I understand how hard it can be. And for these directors that are now on these boards that are in their mid-60s, they grew up in a certain culture with a certain expectation and are comfortable with where things are. And it's hard for them to start to embrace ESG and diversity. I mean, they're just focused on how do I keep my business going as I've done for the past 40 years. So with that, the way to get the new class, you can't completely replace it, but moving slowly is the idea. And so what I promote is well-trained, skills-based, diversely comprised directors who are focused on value creation, which is another word for engaging with investors. And of those in that diversity, right, we need foreign directors. We need younger directors. We need female directors. And there's so many options for doing this. And I believe that just one by one, you start changing these boards, adding some fresh ideas. It's not the whole board you're going to replace. There's plenty of talent on those boards that's critical. But you need to be introducing 2 or 3 more kind of change makers. And I am personally trying to do that through my Japan Board Diversity Network, because my members are not what they call an okazari, which means decoration in Japan, where they'll put a woman on there, but maybe they don't speak, or they'll have somebody be a foreign director, but the idea is that they're not meant to really do much. And those decorations are not for the benefit of Japan. They make everybody happy. They keep everybody comfortable. They keep the harmony in Japan, the wa, right? Very important to have harmony, and everybody agrees. But what they don't do is what Japan needs, which is innovate and change and keep up with the rest of the global world.
Well, this is fascinating, Tracy, and I want to draw a couple parallels if it's not obvious for our listeners, because in some ways you can think, even just say in America, which is usually the conversation point here about saying diversity into the boardroom, which is more than just gender and international background, whatever it might be. You're clearly seeing that. You discussed it as well, but it's also individuals learning, how do I put my candidacy forward? How to put my best foot forward? What are the skills I need to grow and develop? And everyone listening to this show is trying to figure out those exact same things. So it's fascinating because some of this is clearly going to translate across different cultures. So Tracy, let's say someone comes and knocks on your door and says, I need your advice. How do I go and do this? What's sort of the best practice guidance that you begin to give someone so that they can be positioned to take one of these board seats that should be given to an independent director or perhaps a person of diversity in order to bring different thoughts to the boardroom?
Right. So the idea is, so in Japan, like I talk to women a lot in the U.S., but I also focus in Japan. And now in Japan, the demand is so great that the approach to go about getting on a board in Japan is actually quite different. In Japan, there's such a lack of, there's a perceived lack of women. So the women that are very successful are getting 1, 2, 3, 4 board positions. In the U.S., what I would say is, number one, understand the skills that are necessary for a board. And I frequently speak on these topics by looking at skills matrices and what skills are in demand. And I also talk with companies about, hire skill-based boards and figure out what skills you need to make your company successful. But in a nutshell, when I talk to people, and presumably your listeners are not only women, is, really understand your skills. Have your board bio ready, and then, seek opportunities and network and seek globally. I honestly believe that the candidates for Japan are located globally, and they include people who either spent time in Japan or people who simply have an expertise that's relevant to an industry in Japan. But the idea is, again, understand your value proposition. A board bio is not really the answer for Japan, but it's more the answer for U.S. and kind of European focus. But I think people need to start thinking more broadly and more globally, because I believe, and we may get to this question, is that I believe the future board is going to be a very global board for global companies.
And Tracy, to get there, we need change. And you've talked about how that pace is perhaps going slower than many of us would advocate for. And I was just envisioning this packed boardroom full of insiders, and they put their first non-insider on there, right? An independent director, or whatever they look and sound, feel like. That's uncomfortable. And the parallel for anyone listening to this is, imagine maybe, say, a private company here that's full of family members of a multi-generational business. They had their first independent director. That's the same sort of idea of like, well, you're different. Are we listening to you? How are you going to go about helping us? Give us some ideas about how you are, say, positioning someone who's perhaps landing that first breaking glass seat in the boardroom over in Japan, because I'm sure that will translate for lots of people here depending on the opportunities they end up in.
Right. So well, by the way, all companies in Japan now have that requirement, so I think they're at a minimum of 2 independent directors. So we've actually crossed that threshold of having the first and the second. And now the conversation has switched to, how do I harness the power of those independent directors and the women? And honestly, this is not something, if you are the first women going into a boardroom in Japan, the idea, or the first independent going into Japan, that is a massive, massive undertaking. Like being a board director on Facebook, where you're one of, X number, where everybody's independent, and I talk about this quite frequently, is if you're one of an independent director and it's majority independent, your responsibility is very different than if you're like one of 2 or one of 3, or if you're the only female. It is so much harder. And so what I am trying to do through my network is to bring all of these women who are actually, many of my network are like the key leaders and the key change makers in Japan, is to bring together the ideas on how to be effective. But it's also working through the boardrooms, because you can be the most rock star, super change maker, most educated, superb board candidate. But if your board is not open to change, you will be severely limited. So you can learn the best practices and you can learn how to do that, and you can get support from your networks on how to do that. But I think that goes back to when you're going through an interview process and you're finding a board, assuming that you want to actually contribute to the board and not just want the board position, you really have to hear the words when they say, we want you to contribute your opinions. And if that's not the case, then the effectiveness is going to be limited. Now, I've also spoken with women in my network who say, well, look, even if they're not sure that they want my opinions at the beginning, once I'm in there, I can then start to make change slowly. And I believe that is also a path, because I think once they see and once they hear the opinions of these women and they realize, oh my gosh, I had no idea, that is how you shift the culture. So the advice is be excellent, right? The first advice is simply be an excellent director. And secondly, just in terms of content, and being excellent means knowing your content and then also continuing to learn how to be effective. But it's hard, and I can't even imagine how these new directors, again, in that insider environment where they have very little information, the internal management is basically just saying, here's our proposals and you need to approve everything. That's a hard position, but I want people to know how valuable they are in that role.
Well, I think that translates also directly to many situations at companies, even just here in America. And I will summarize it and I'll say, it sounds like the advice is this is a heavy responsibility. And we think that's true for board director but definitely more so in Japan. And so when I think about the example you just gave, there are boards today that are sort of seen as rubber stamping. That's what management would want. Like, we're going to give you the ideas. You say, yes, these are brilliant, go and do them, as opposed to hold us accountable or say, well, wait a minute, why is that our strategy and our competitors doing something different? Help me understand why this is good for us and that's good for them. And it sounds like in some ways that could be so much harder in Japan, where you're changing that culture and mindset, and you need to probably find the right people that are going to be successful in the beginning, because it begins to set a path for others to follow, right? So have you noticed that as when this was beginning to take shape, that you were trying to coach people in a certain way because they were the pioneers, but now people need different skill set or different approaches? Because I think this probably helps a lot of us who are imagining the board that we're going to join as we do due diligence. Are you the first person that's from a different industry or of a different age bracket, and therefore you're going to have to handle the board a bit differently than if there's, like you said on the example of Facebook, where there's so much diversity of opinion and thought that just adding someone else actually can be really seen as valuable. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I think that's exactly right. And I'll mention an April, and I know the timing of the release may be different, but my April event will host former Ambassador Roos. So the former ambassador to Japan, John Roos, who is on the board of both Salesforce and formerly of the board of Sony, now on the board of Rakuten. In addition, on that event, I will have former PayPal executive Louise Pentland, who is an independent director at Hitachi. And what we're going to talk about is really what is the role of the independent director. Because when I'm speaking with my members, right, they are the pioneers, the first independent directors in Japan and the first female independent directors in Japan. And they want to learn, how can I be more effective? And they want to bring, they're reading their MSCI ESG reports and asking me, hey, how do I bring this to my board? What do I know? And I can just see them wanting to make the change. And I can just see, though, through that, why it's so important that they really get a strong idea of what the role of the independent director is, because it's still very new. And now John and Luis both serve on perhaps the most progressive boards in Japan, Rakuten and Sony. Rakuten, the language of English. Sony is, of course, such a global company. And that's going to be quite different. But I at least want to draw attention to the role of the independent director, and that it's not just rubber stamping. And I continually emphasize you have such a heavy responsibility as an independent director, both in being excellent for corporate governance, but also in promoting diversity, because that's where Japan, needs you to speak out.
So, Tracy, in some ways, we've talked about the origin of this and we can understand the history. But when I think about your, say, Japan Board Diversity Network and maybe the vision you've got for going forward, where do you envision in 5 or 10 years? And obviously, things are going to continue to probably to change a lot and the numbers will grow in terms of independent directors and diversity on boards. Where do you think we'll be in 5 or 10 years? We talked about the pace of change has been fairly slow thus far.
Right. No, I have high hopes for Japan. I mean, you're always going to have your pioneers, your, followers, and then your laggards, right? And I can see the pioneers. And right now, it is still the case in Japan that if there is not a woman in the boardroom or there's not a woman in a meeting, nobody looks around and says, this feels uncomfortable. And one of my most popular LinkedIn posts was about, I believe it was, I might get this wrong, I believe it was a Mitsubishi executive who went to Japan from Belgium and looked around and said, where are all the women? He just felt something wasn't quite right. And Japan is not yet at that feeling of, wow, it feels really strange. And while we're talking about this, I want to point out a key other issue, which is the shikoyakuin, which is the executive director levels. And you've got maybe 30 shikoyakuin at, Hitachi and at Itochu. And Hitachi, got its first executive director, a woman named Lorena Della Genova from, I believe she's from Italy, because they were having these executive meetings with 32 men and not a single woman. And that is a severe problem. So I think we can start more easily at the board level for change because the shikoyakuin generally are internal hires, and women, for the obvious reasons, have not risen in the ranks of these Japanese companies. They had to go overseas. They had to, they had to make their own companies because they never had those opportunities to have a career at Japanese companies. But if I circle back, where do I see Japan? I see Japan improving. I don't know that they'll get there in the next 5 years, but I do anticipate that this AGM season, which will be in June, Japan has the shortest, proxy season in the world. I mean, most of the annual meetings are held during 1 week. And I believe that we'll see a lot of elections of female directors this week, which will inch up the percentage. And so I am hopeful that the percentage of board directors will increase substantially in the next 5 years. And I think solving the issue of the executive directors will also improve, but still take a little bit more time and maybe a decade. But I believe the new generation has the mindset that their wives work and that there needs to be more of a shared responsibility for the, housework and family life so that the women can move forward in their careers. And alongside that, though, as we promote diversity as well, it's also the shift in corporate governance that is so critical to Japan's future. It's the unwinding of these cross-shareholdings. It's the accountability to shareholders. And that is the mindset that seems even harder to change than just adding a few women to the board. And so I'm personally hoping to change that through my advocacy and also through mobilizing my women to be, corporate governance spokespeople on their boards.
So, Tracy, let me just even expand that question a little bit broader. I should probably think about it. When we think about the future of the boardroom, there's probably an answer globally and probably also related to that in Japan. And they probably overlap a bit, but not entirely. So when you sort of pull out that crystal ball, we just looked a few years ahead in Japan, whether it's that time frame or even a little bit further down the road, what do you think the future of the boardroom is both globally and in Japan?
Right. So what I promote is global boards. And I often, I cite some of the same examples, but MasterCard is just, every time I look at MasterCard, I just am so impressed with the level of, gender diversity, skills diversity, ethnicity. They have everything. And in fact, they have, a known Japanese executive, Oki Matsumoto, on their board as well. And I think the future of boards should be global, to get global perspectives. And for Japan right now, given that it's such a homogenous country, so that when we talk about diversity, really the main focus has been gender, but we can obviously expand that to other areas, including disability, gender orientation, etc. And I just see that as just making innovation skyrocket, because I fundamentally believe that the whole diversity in thought is driven by the cognitive diversity that is gained through bringing different people with different backgrounds and different skills. And I heard Larry speak. Larry thinks from BlackRock obviously speaks specifically about Japan, and he also emphasizes what Japan needs is diversity of mind. And so if we can get the boardrooms in Japan to have that diversity in mind and go away from the every man, it's all men in the boardroom, all raised at the same time, all enter the company at the same time, all indoctrinated with the same philosophies, and shift that up, you'll limit the blind spots, you'll increase the performance, you'll increase the innovation, and you'll also send a message to your employees, both female and global, that Japan welcomes them, and maybe they could also be in the boardroom one day.
Well, we appreciate the good work that you are doing to advance the cause in Japan for corporate governance, and we were delighted to have you on the show today, especially to share that history and background. I never heard that level of detail before. I've learned so much. We appreciate you sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
Thank you so much.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Tracy Gopal. It was amazing to hear about the history of corporate governance in Japan, how that is growing and changing in so many exciting and important ways, but also the lessons learned for people seeking a board seat there, but how those apply over here and the takeaways for all of us, especially including the implications for how Japan may grow and change in the future, maybe what that means for own investing. And remember, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you'll find links to all of today's resources. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to Boardroom Bound.